April 4th, 1945. On this date, the illusion of a clean war evaporated. Allied troops were pushing deep into Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing. Speed was everything. But for the soldiers of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry, the mission abruptly changed near the town of Gotha. The maps identified the target as a generic military site, perhaps an ammunition dump, maybe a rear command post. Why did the convoy halt? The intelligence reports promised a standard capture, but the air told a different story. A smell hit the lead vehicles, thick, sweet, rotting. It forced combat veterans to cover their faces. The soldiers dismounted. They gripped their rifles. They walked toward the facility known as Ohrdruf. The gates opened, the engines cut out. In the frame, a landscape of absolute horror. The Americans froze. They did not see soldiers or bunkers. They saw piles of bodies, hundreds of them. Some lay twisted in muddy ditches. Others were stacked like cordwood against the walls of wooden barracks. These were not just corpses. They were evidence of industrial slaughter. At first glance, a pile of discarded dolls. But in reality, men starved into nothingness. Ribs protruded through papery skin. Limbs looked like dry twigs. The few survivors barely registered the arrival of their liberators. They did not cheer. They could not stand. Some dragged themselves through the dirt in ragged striped uniforms. Others were naked. The camera records, hollow eyes staring into the lens. The silence was broken only by low moans. The Americans had seen combat. They had seen death. But they had never seen this. This was a slave labor camp. The prisoners had been forced to dig underground tunnels. They laid railways for German weapons production until their bodies failed. Then they were discarded. Death came from exhaustion, from starvation, from a bullet to the back of the head. But this was only the beginning. The SS guards had fled 24 hours earlier. They tried to scrub the crime scene. They lit bonfires. The footage shows half-burned bodies smoldering in the pits. The ground was soaked in oil and blood. The tools of torture lay in plain sight. The soldiers realized the truth immediately. This was not a prison. It was a factory of death. April 11th, 1945. On this date, the American Third Army rolled into Buchenwald. This was not a small detention center like Ohrdruf. This was the heart of the system. At first glance, a military installation near Weimar, but in reality, a factory of death. It had operated since 1937. 250,000 prisoners had passed through its iron gates. Jews, French resistance fighters, Polish political opponents, Roma families, priests and teachers. The list was endless. The American jeep stopped. The soldiers expected a fight. Instead, they found the main gates wide open. Inside, 21,000 survivors waited. They did not run to greet the liberators. Most could barely stand. The footage shows men with hollow eyes leaning against the barbed wire. Their limbs are like sticks. The camp was a graveyard above ground. Soldiers stepped past piles of naked bodies stacked like firewood. They entered rooms filled with gray human ash. They opened storage warehouses packed to the ceiling. Thousands of pairs of shoes, spectacles, suitcases. It was a museum of the murdered. But the horror went deeper. The troops entered the crematorium building. The ovens were not cold. They were still warm. The machinery had been running until the very last hour. Next to the furnaces, the tools of the trade hung on the walls. Gallows, heavy chains, meat hooks used for slow strangulation. Then, in a nearby office, the soldiers found something else. Lampshades, book covers. They were not made of leather. They were made of tattooed human skin. Battle-hardened infantrymen broke down. Some vomited. Others wept in the courtyard. How were there any survivors left to save? The SS had planned to liquidate the camp, but the prisoners refused to die. 3 days before the Americans arrived, the starving inmates organized. They raided the armory. They captured the watchtowers. They took the remaining SS guards prisoner. Men who looked like skeletons showed impossible physical strength. They held the camp until the tanks arrived. What began as a shock at Ohrdruf now became a global awakening. There was no longer any doubt. The Allies finally understood the true scope of the Nazi crimes. It was not just war, it was extermination. Events accelerated. While the Americans secured Buchenwald, British forces pushed hard through northern Germany. They were unaware that they were about to witness an even darker nightmare. April 15th, 1945. That was the day the illusion broke. Soldiers of the British 11th Armored Division drove their tanks through the gates. They expected a standard prison camp. They found a graveyard. Bergen-Belsen operated differently from Auschwitz. There were no gas chambers here, no industrial killing machines, but death was still absolute. Why did the camp collapse into such chaos? It was never designed for mass extermination. But as the Allied forces squeezed the Third Reich, the Nazis panicked. They evacuated prisoners from the east. Thousands of Jews and political captives were forced onto death marches. They were dumped here. The population swelled. The infrastructure broke. The system failed completely. At first glance, piles of discarded rags on the ground, but in reality, they were human bodies. 60,000 prisoners remained. Most could not stand. They lay on the dirt, unable to lift their heads. Beside the living lay 13,000 corpses, unburied, rotting in the open fields. The smell of decomposition hit the soldiers miles away. It stuck to their uniforms. It coated the inside of the tanks. There was no escape. The fences kept them in, but the real killers were microscopic. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. These diseases tore through the overcrowded barracks. Hygiene was non-existent. Water was scarce. Starvation accelerated the end. Survivors spoke of their diet: a crust of moldy bread, a cup of watery turnip soup. This went on for weeks. The British troops froze. Many were battle-hardened veterans, others were young conscripts. None were prepared for this level of cruelty. The archival footage shows soldiers covering their faces with handkerchiefs to block the stench. Some vomit beside their jeeps. Confusion is visible in their eyes, but there was no time for emotion. Action was required immediately. The Royal Army Medical Corps arrived with emergency supplies. They set up field hospitals. They established triage zones. Nurses moved row by row. They washed the survivors. They administered small, controlled portions of food. A full meal would have killed the starving prisoners instantly. The long process of recovery began. But for thousands, help arrived too late. One meal was enough to kill them. Starving prisoners ate the rations given by soldiers, but their bodies shut down. Their stomachs ruptured. The sudden nourishment became a death sentence. Why did the liberators burn the barracks? It seemed like destruction of evidence. But the threat of typhus was stronger than the need for preservation. British soldiers made a command decision. They set fire to the wooden structures. Inside, the corpses were still present. The flames consumed the wood and the dead alike. It was the only way to halt the epidemic. The footage shows a heavy bulldozer blade pushing forward. It does not move earth or rubble. It moves a wall of human bodies. The soldiers could not carry the dead by hand. There were simply too many. The engines roared, pushing the victims into open pits. Richard Dimbleby walked into this nightmare. He was a young BBC war reporter, accustomed to the front lines. But here, his composure cracked. He recorded a dispatch describing the sights and the smells. He sent the tape to London. At first glance, a standard field report. But in reality, a testimony so dark, the producers refused to believe it. The BBC hesitated. The executives thought Dimbleby had lost his mind or exaggerated the scale. They delayed the broadcast. But there was no exaggeration. It was the absolute truth. Bergen-Belsen became the undeniable proof of Nazi intent. It showed the world that this was not random cruelty. It was an organized industrial system of extermination. But the horror did not end with the arrival of troops. It got worse. Despite the field hospitals and the best efforts of British doctors, the dying continued. In the weeks following liberation, 14,000 more people perished. Disease and exhaustion had gone too deep. Survivors carried these memories forever. But while the British scrubbed the disease from Belsen, the Americans approached a different kind of hell in southern Germany. April 29, 1945. The U.S. 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions reached the outskirts of Munich. They stopped at a complex named Dachau. This was not just another camp, it was the origin point. The camera records, the infamous Iron Gate with the slogan Arbeit macht frei. Dachau opened in March 1933, mere weeks after Adolf Hitler seized power. It served as the prototype, the blueprint. Every concentration camp built afterward was modeled on this facility. Over 12 years, 200,000 prisoners passed through its system. The Americans prepared to breach the perimeter. 30,000 documented murders. That was the minimum cost of Dachau. Through its iron gates passed a parade of the condemned, Jews, priests, artists, and resistance fighters. Anyone the regime wanted to erase ended up here. They died from the bullet. They died from the rope. But mostly, they died from the slow, grinding agony of disease and starvation. When the American troops entered the complex, the silence was heavy. Then came the smell. The footage shows train cars standing motionless on the tracks. There were over 30 boxcars. They were not empty. They were packed to the ceiling with corpses. These were the victims of the death marches, prisoners evacuated from other camps, forced to walk until their hearts stopped. The Germans had fled the advancing Allied forces, leaving this cargo of death rotting in the sun. Inside the perimeter, the soldiers found the barracks. Why were the conditions so lethal? The buildings were designed to hold 200 men, but in reality, the Nazis crammed over 1,000 into each structure. Prisoners lay on wooden bunks stacked 4 levels high. There was no space to turn. Many were too weak to stand, their skin covered in open sores. Lice swarmed over the living and the dead alike. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and decay. The liberating troops were battle-hardened, but this broke them. Some soldiers dropped their weapons and wept openly. Others reacted with violence. They rounded up the remaining SS guards. The chain of command briefly collapsed. Unable to control their rage at the sights before them, American soldiers lined up several German captors against a wall and opened fire. They executed them on the spot. But this was only the beginning. Dachau possessed a fully operational infrastructure for killing. There was a gas chamber, smaller than the ones at Auschwitz, but functional. There were soundproof torture cells. There were execution walls pockmarked by bullets. The crematoriums had run day and night. In the yards, soldiers stumbled upon mounds of gray dust. It was human ash, mixed with fragments of bone. The Americans immediately mobilized. They set up medical tents. They distributed bread and soup. Doctors worked without sleep to treat the survivors. But for many, liberation came too late. Their bodies were too shattered to process food. They died free, but they died all the same. While the Western Allies grappled with this nightmare in Germany, the revelation had actually started months earlier. July 1944. The Soviet Red Army pushed toward the outskirts of Lublin, Poland. They expected fortifications. Instead, they found Majdanek. The gates stood wide open. At first glance, it was strangely quiet, but in reality, it was a factory of death. Soviet soldiers entered the perimeter with rifles raised. They checked the corners. They kicked open the doors. Inside, they discovered the machinery of Majdanek. The camp had operated since 1941. It was one of the first facilities to combine slave labor with industrial execution. The soldiers moved deeper into the complex. The archives preserved the footage. In the frame, rows of brick crematorium ovens, intact gas chambers, storage rooms packed to the ceiling. They found thousands of pairs of shoes, heaps of civilian clothes, mountains of human ash. Canisters of Zyklon B crystals were stacked on the floor, ready for use. This liberation marked a turning point. For the first time, the world saw clear physical proof of the extermination system. The Soviets counted the dead, 80,000 victims. Most were Jews or Soviet prisoners of war. Why was so much evidence left behind? The Germans usually destroyed everything. But here, panic took over. The Nazis had tried to cover their tracks. They smashed some of the gas chambers. They burned bodies in open pits to erase the volume of the slaughter. But the Red Army advanced too quickly. The retreat was chaotic. The evidence remained. But this was only the beginning. Months passed. January 27, 1945. The Red Army reached the outskirts of the Polish town of Auschwitz. They approached a new facility. It was Auschwitz. What they found here dwarfed everything else. Auschwitz was not a single location. It was a sprawling metropolis of destruction. 3 main complexes stood on the frozen ground: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II Birkenau, and Auschwitz III Monowitz. Over 40 smaller camps surrounded them. The scale was incomprehensible. By the time Soviet troops breached the wire, the SS guards had vanished. They did not leave alone. They forced tens of thousands of prisoners onto the roads, driving them westward on deadly marches. The soldiers searched the barracks. 7,000 people remained. 7,000 kilograms of human hair. That is what the soldiers found packed in paper bags. Scattered across the campgrounds were piles of spectacles, mountains of shoes reaching the ceiling, suitcases with names written in chalk, baby clothes stiff with dirt. The footage shows endless mounds of personal belongings. Each item represented a life extinguished. This was Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was the epicenter of the final solution. 1.1 million people were murdered here. Jews, Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war. The machine of death did not discriminate. How did they manage to kill so many? Efficiency was the key. They built gas chambers and disguised them as communal showers. The victims walked in expecting water. They received Zyklon B instead. After the suffocation came the ovens. Bodies were incinerated in industrial crematoriums. Ashes were dumped into the nearby rivers or used as fertilizer for fields. But the end was approaching. When the Red Army advanced, the SS panicked. They rigged explosives to the gas chambers. They burned the archives. They tried to erase history before fleeing west. But time ran out. The ruins remained. The Soviets entered the gates and saw the scale of the atrocity. There was no mistake. The evidence was irrefutable. The soldiers moved deeper into the complex. At first glance, they looked like corpses, but in reality, they were breathing men and women. The camera records, skeletal figures standing behind barbed wire. Their skin is stretched tight over bone. They weighed less than 80 pounds. They clung to life with whatever strength remained. Medics rushed to the barracks. Field hospitals appeared within hours. Soldiers handed out blankets, medicine, and warm soup. Doctors administered glucose. But for thousands, liberation came too late. Their bodies had endured too much starvation. Their digestive systems shut down. The shock of food killed them. They survived the Nazis, but they could not survive the recovery. It was a similar scene in Buchenwald. Among the living skeletons was a 15-year-old boy named Elie Wiesel. He had lost his mother. He had lost his father. He had lost his sister. The camp took his childhood, but it did not take his voice. He survived to become a witness. He wrote down exactly what he saw so the memory would not fade. The world was forced to listen.